I thought you were just here because it was the Barry lectures and Dr. Kelly was here. You just burst my bubble. Now, I don't know how many kids we'd have in chapel. Our chapel, we have chapel once a week. How often is chapel? You have twice a week? What are your days? Tuesday, Thursday. We have chapel once a week, although there's other opportunities. They'll have student chapels and stuff, but it's Wednesday at 10. Every week, so we've got like 1,800 who have to get swiped in. And there's little machines at every exit, and they're guarded, like by security, so somebody doesn't sneak in and try to swipe. But that's the big thing about how you control the swiping, because they have to get like 96 credits to graduate. If they get to the end of graduation, they don't have 96 chapel credits, they can't graduate. So then they have to go do other things to get those credits made up, and it's far harder than just going to chapel. Do you all swipe a card, or that's how you do it? But you got a little more controlled environment here. You can see if people are trying to cheat, right? We don't cheat here. They don't cheat at Clear Creek. Grass is always green. All right. If you look back to the handout, that one-page handout that was in the material you got earlier, get down here to guides for interpretation. So here I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I go about approaching a parable and how I might start to prepare if I were going to teach or preach one. Let's start with number one. Beware of assuming every parable has only one point. Now, I've already gotten into this some earlier, so I'm not going to redo it completely. But I'm going to suggest something that Craig Blomberg is a New Testament person. If you look at the handout at the bottom of that page, you see I've got a little bibliography down there. These are items that I've found helpful over the years. Most of them pretty recent, but a few older ones. But Craig Blomberg is a really, really good New Testament person. He's got a book, Interpreting the Parables, and then also Preaching the Parables. And both those are really good works. More recent is the Preaching the Parables. But he's someone who suggested that it's too limiting to say a parable can only have one point. I think he's right about that, and I'd thought that too, but I hadn't thought of a way to at least open up more than one point for at least some of the parables. So he suggests in both of those books that I've recommended to you that you think about a parable from the perspective of each of the main characters in the story. This at least opens up a different point of view for what you might say this parable means. Okay, so let's take, for example, that parable in Luke chapter 15. I'm not going to call it anything. I'm just going to say in Luke chapter 15, there's a parable about lostness. There's a parable of the lost sheep. There's a parable of the lost coins. And then there's the parable of the what? Parable of the what? Okay, parable of the prodigal son. If that's how you think about that story, then you're seeing the story from the viewpoint of a prodigal. And that might really resonate with some people, particularly someone who lived life far from God. Maybe at some point they were part of the church, but then they drifted away, went 180 degrees away from the church. And maybe this story helps draw that person back. Or maybe you're moved when you hear this story because you identify with the prodigal, right? Is that the only thing you could call that story? What else could you call it? How about the parable of the elder brother or the parable of the other son? He's at least as important as the prodigal in that. He's just in the second half of it. Both these brothers sort of are equally important in that story. But that older brother, you remember, never leaves the property. From all outward observance, he would look like he's right with the father. He's doing things for all the right reasons. He's committed to his father. He's obedient to his father. But what you find out at the end, he's not really committed to his father. He's doing these things because he gets a benefit from it. There's no joy because his brothers come back. He leaves the party, that his father is throwing, causing the father to have to leave it also, this son's lost too. Now, lots of people who will hear you teach or preach will not identify with the prodigal. I mean, I became a believer at 10 years old, First Baptist Church, Middlesboro. My story is not, I was a drug dealer, I was cooking methamphetamines, I was spending my money on prostitutes, and I mean, I don't have a story like that. And not to say it was a direct line from 10 years old to godliness. I mean, it's been much more, but there has been an upward movement overall. But I don't have any stories about drug addiction, about, you name some woman accuses me of the sexual. I don't have any of these stories. Thanks be to God. No, I don't claim somehow my superiority in that. That's just not been my story. I don't identify with the prodigal that much. As a 10-year-old, I didn't see myself like a prodigal son. But at times in my life, I have identified with that other brother. For all outward appearance, all's good, committed to all the right things, but not there. Just going through the motions, no heart, no passion. I've had plenty of those times. And in those times, that brother. So what's that parable about? Well, it depends on kind of which of those 2 points of views you look from. So you could call it the parable of the 2 lost sons. There's another way there's another character in that story. The father. So maybe you want to emphasize the father. So the parable of the loving father. Now, I don't think that's 3 different parables, but if you focus on a different character, a different point of view, you might come out with a little different point. And Blomberg is the first person why did I not think of that? But I didn't. I read it in Craig Blomberg and I thought, brilliant. It makes so much sense. And at least it opens up the possibility of a little bit of that. And not just, there's the point, and I'm done with it. And so this is one way to get at that. So using Blomberg, he suggests you ask, oftentimes these parables have 3 main characters. That's pretty standard in Jesus' stories. So who are the 3 main characters, or who are the 2 main characters? So pay attention to that. That's what I've just talked about. Notice what's at the beginning and what's at the end. Because often you'll get clues about where you might find the meaning in the way it's introduced. Like in Luke chapter 15, when Jesus says the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled and complained because he ate with sinners and tax collectors. And that's when you get the story of the lost sheep, lost coin, and the lost sons. That's pretty important to know. That's the audience he's speaking to, and that they're complaining about him reaching out to the least, the last, and the lost. That helps you maybe frame what this parable is about. I'd look at the end. See how the parable concludes. You might get information there that opens up meaning that you might otherwise miss. And then third, pay attention to the direct discourse. Who's talking? And the father has a lot of dialogue in that parable in Luke 15. The elder brother has more dialogue than the younger brother. And the dialogue might be a clue to places we should look for emphasis. All that to say, Jesus' parables rarely have just one character. So think about each of the characters in the story and ask yourself, what's the meaning of this story from the point of view of this character in the story? What's the nuance to this story if you look at it from this character's point of view? And I think that could be helpful. So you're doing this already because you might call it the parable of the prodigal son. Well, you're thinking of it from that point of view. Or the 2 lost sons, or the elder brother, or the loving father. All that opens up a little bit of nuance and meaning depending upon which of those characters you're focused on. So that's the first thing I would say observe in interpreting a parable. The second thing is pay attention. I got to get a little German in here, right? I just have to. I'm a New Testament person. It's the Barry Lectures, so I need a little bit of academic acumen in this. So how about this? Observe the Sitz im Leben. That's a fancy German word for setting in life, or the situation in life. And you can look at any story that Jesus tells and ask two questions of it. The first one is, what's going on in the life of Jesus when he tells that story? And that's an important question to ask. Where is he? What's going on? Who's challenging him? That's important. Second question is, how has the gospel writer employed it in his story? There's like two levels at work here. Luke's gospel is not Luke following Jesus around, writing down everything that he sees and hears, and so what you get there is a play-by-play, blow-by-blow account. Luke wasn't even a follower of Jesus when Jesus was walking around Galilee and Jerusalem. He's not an eyewitness of the things that he's narrating. I think he gets that from eyewitnesses. He says that in the opening of his gospel. But he has heard these stories that Jesus had told from other people, from eyewitnesses. And I would say it's by the inspiration of the Spirit, has determined which stories to include, which stories to exclude. He has put them in a certain order. For example, Luke's stories, Luke's parables of Jesus, almost all fall in his journey to Jerusalem section. Now this is important. In Mark's gospel, Mark's got a whole series of parables of Jesus. Parable of the sower, parable of the soil, or the seed, the mustard seed, parable of the leaven, parable of the treasure in the field. He's got a whole series of parables in Mark chapter 4. Very early in Jesus' Galilean ministry. It's basically his parable chapter. Now he's got some more, but he's got a whole list of them, one right after the other. Matthew does the same thing in Matthew 13, still in Galilee. Now there's a few more parables that come later in the story, but they're almost all focused early in Galilee. But how about Luke? There's only one parable of Luke in Galilee. In Luke's gospel, there's only one parable of Jesus in Galilee, and it's the parable of the sower, and it's in chapter 8. Now I want you to look at 9:51, Luke chapter 9, verse 51. So the parable of the sower comes in Luke chapter 8. It's actually Luke 8, 4 through 8. So you get the parable of the sower and the soils in Luke 8. Then Luke 9:51 marks a rather significant turning point in the way Luke narrates Jesus' ministry, life and ministry. You see what he says? What did Jesus do? He set his face, or he turned his face to go to Jerusalem. Now that's the beginning of a journey to Jerusalem section. Now in Matthew and Mark, that journey to Jerusalem is a very brief section. In Mark, it's like 2 chapters, not even 2 full chapters. About the same in Matthew, but in Luke it runs from 9:51 to 19:28. Did you hear what I said? Chapter 19, verse 28. That's when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. 9:51 through 19:27-28. It's the biggest section in Luke's gospel, the journey to Jerusalem section. It's huge. And I have my students read that travel section in my New Testament class. They have to read it and answer some questions from it, and they think, oh, well, that's not going to be that bad, that journey to Jerusalem section. But it's about as long as Mark's gospel. It's a huge section. That's where the parables are in Luke's gospel. Look on the back page of that handout that I provided for you. See if I can find it. I got one in here. So there it is. See that? So they're in order. They move A, B, C, D, E, F, and then E, D, C, B, A. I'll talk about that later. But notice where they fall. 10:30, parable of the Good Samaritan. 9:51 is he starts to Jerusalem. Then the parable of the Good Samaritan comes. I told you 19, 27, 28 is when he arrives in Jerusalem. Look at the last one, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. The parables of Jesus in Luke, with the exception of the parable of the sower and maybe one or two during Passion Week, are all in the journey section. Now, very, very few of these show up in any of the other Gospels. But what's that say about these stories in Luke? That journey to Jerusalem is like Jesus is on his way, and what's going to happen when he gets there? This isn't just any journey to Jerusalem. This is he's going up there to be arrested and be crucified. I mean, he's coming to the climactic moment, the climactic events of his life and ministry. He's on his way there. And he's trying to teach his disciples. The miracles decrease. He hardly performs any miracles in this section. It's all focused on teaching his disciples and others who are listening. But they don't look like they're quite ready for this. I mean, if you just look at them, they need more instruction. I mean, they still don't understand. They're stumbling around asking him questions that seem like basic questions. They should be further along than this. I'm thinking when I'm reading it, where's their faith? They're still worried about bread in a boat after he's fed a multitude twice? I mean, they're still freaking out in a boat in a storm? How could they doubt? And so Jesus is teaching them, and they need it. That journey to Jerusalem is like the 2-minute warning in a football game. You know what happened? I mean, we're down to the climax now. And don't things change in the 2-minute warning? I mean, bad teams suddenly start slinging the ball all over the field, moving the ball, and you're like, why don't they do this the whole game? There's an urgency. And that's where Jesus is. And in that 2-minute warning, it's actually a long 2 minutes, but you know what I mean. In this journey, this is where he teaches them in parables. And it's important to know that as you're reading these. Don't you think that Jesus is focusing on the issues he thinks are the most significant? Because we're down now to crunch time. So the issues he's raising in these parables in Luke are the most important issues for his disciples. And I think it's important just to note like how the parables are placed in a particular gospel. And that gives us some insight into their meaning. Looking over these parables in Luke. If I said to you, what are some emphasis that you find in Luke's gospel? This is one of my favorite things to do with the Gospels, is to go through and say, how is Luke's gospel unique? Or what is it that is a characteristic of Luke over against Matthew or Mark or John? You know, I want to hear Luke's voice. We have 4 Gospels, not one. So what are some of Luke's emphasis? Yes, ma'am. And he does. He and Matthew have the birth stories, but he does. He's one of the two that has it, and I think he was a physician, and I think this may sort of nuance the things that he wants to tell because of his background, because of his experiences. I think that's a very good point. If I had to name 2 or 3 of them, I'd say one is the gospel is for all people, even the outcasts, even the marginalized, even those who are pushed to the margins of society. Jesus keeps getting in trouble in Luke's gospel because he sits down and eats with sinners and tax collectors. Because he's willing to show dignity and respect to people that other people say, don't you know who they are? Or, boy, Jesus, you're really going to hurt your reputation if you hang around with those people. So, you know, if the incarnation happened in the 21st century, let's just say, he came to Pineville, Kentucky, wouldn't that be the kind of place he'd be born? Pineville? I guess we'd need to be somewhere closer to Israel. But if we're just going to totally update it, you know, Pineville's one of those kind of out-of-the-way places. Now, if you've always lived here, you probably don't think it's out of the way. But if you're from Temple, Texas, Pineville's out of the way, isn't it? Like Bethlehem. And so, now, you got me thinking about that. I'm thinking, what in the world was I talking about that I started talking about that? But what was I talking about? Temple, Texas got me distracted there. Yeah, that it's about the outcast and Jesus' concern for everybody. But yeah, if he incarnated himself today, where would he eat? Chick-fil-A? Y'all don't have one of those, but that's big in my town. That was the biggest thing happened at OBU since I've been there. They put a Chick-fil-A in where the student center is, so that was huge. If he was in town today, he would have eaten over there where I had lunch here on campus, because that was really good. I'm convinced. If I had to pick one place, the kind of place where Jesus would eat, it would be the Waffle House. Now, not because, did you guess it? He guessed it. That would be his place. Not only is the food good, you can find all kinds of people in the Waffle House. Kid you not, I was in a Waffle House in the Oklahoma City area and saw Toby Keith, country music singer. He's from Moore, Oklahoma. Toby Keith was at the Waffle House. All right? I've also been at the Waffle House where I would guess the people who were there would pay with food stamps if the Waffle House would take them. You can find all kinds of people in a Waffle House. That's exactly the kind of place where Jesus would go. Now, if I were at the Waffle House eating, and let's say somebody there of a rather low reputation in the community was also at the Waffle House eating, which could happen because all kinds of people eat at the Waffle House, and Jesus came in, I'm sort of sad to think he probably wouldn't come to my table. That's the story that Luke tells. That's Luke's story. That Jesus is for the least, the last, and the lost. Now that's true in all the Gospels, but Luke just keeps emphasizing that even more than the other Gospels do. So look at these parables now. What's the first parable after the parable of the sower, which is kind of the parable of parables? What's the first one? Parable of the Good Samaritan? Are you kidding me? Samaritans aren't good. They're not good in the eyes of the people Jesus is telling that story to. They hate Samaritans. You asked me about, people not understanding these stories. When we hear this story today, of course everybody knows the Samaritan's going to stop. Why? Because the Samaritan's good. Of course good people stop. It's the bad people who don't stop. So yes, the Samaritan stops. But if that's what you think, you've completely missed the point of the story. The Samaritan's the last person that should have stopped because Jews hated Samaritans, and I'm sure Samaritans didn't care much for Jews. So you got a Jewish man in the ditch. The Samaritan's the last person who would stop. Who did Jesus make the hero of that story? A Samaritan. And I just think that doesn't work for us now unless you explain it. Because we think Samaritans are good. Of course that's why they stopped. Samaritans were bad, at least in the eyes of the people Jesus is telling that story to. Go to the last of these parables in this travel section. Pharisee and a tax collector go down to the temple. Guess who goes away righteous? Now we're going to say, well, not the Pharisee, because, they're the bad guys. It's almost like we've got this caricature Pharisees that they're the bad guys who walk out on stage and they've got the long black mustache and they twist it like that and people boo and hiss. When you see Pharisee in the story, it's like boo, hiss, and they're twirling their mustache like that. They're not like that at all. They can be hypocritical. They can misunderstand Jesus, but these are people who believed their Bible. They were trying to live out their Bible as best they could. Now, they could be hypocritical. Hey, they had issues. I'm not here to defend Pharisees as the righteous people in the story. But they were the Bible teachers. They were the doctors. They were the professors. So you get one of those who goes down and a tax collector. Now, we still don't like tax collectors. I mean, April 15th, right? If those of you who pay taxes, and we can make jokes about the IRS, and part of the way you get elected is tell people you're going to lower their taxes. It's you get it. We don't like taxes, and we don't like the people who collect them. I was interim at First Baptist Shawnee one time, and I'm hammering tax collectors, and a guy comes up afterwards, and a guy that I liked a lot, he said, "I just want you to know I'm retired from the IRS." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't talking about you," but he was joking. He said, "Man, you're really giving tax collectors a bad name." So you get a tax collector and you get a Pharisee going down to the temple. Everybody knows which one of those two is going to be justified before God, not the tax collector. They're hated, despised. And not like we hate tax collectors. These Jewish people were paying Rome so that they could live in their own land, the land that God had given to them. And these Jewish tax collectors had volunteered to collect taxes from their own Jewish brothers and sisters on behalf of Rome, who was oppressing them. Now, how you like them apples? You think you don't like the tax guy? What if that tax guy represented a nation that had taken your country by force, and you got no benefit whatsoever from the taxes you pay? See, I do. I mean, I drive to school every day on roads that are paid for by the taxes I pay. If I'm in trouble and need help, I dial 911. Those people who show up are paid by the taxes. I get benefits from the taxes I pay. These Jewish people couldn't see any benefits they were getting. In fact, they were paying taxes to help enforce and keep in power a foreign oppressor who lived in their land and charged them for living in it. So who gets justified that day? The tax collector does. And that's the first, and that's the last, and that's about when Jesus gets to Jerusalem. Here's what I'm saying. We should pay attention not just to the individual story, like we rip it out of Luke and wave it around like it's this isolated story. It's part of Luke's gospel. We should see it in Luke's gospel. And it helps highlight things for us. Another characteristic of Luke's gospel, prayer. I think there's 11 prayers of Jesus in Luke's gospel. There's 4 in Mark. If you wanted the gospel where you see Jesus praying, it's either going to be John or Luke. So Jesus prays a lot in Luke's gospel. He's praying at all the pivotal moments. You look at Luke's story when Jesus is baptized, it says, and when Jesus was praying and was baptized. Just kind of throws in and he was praying. The other gospels don't do that. The night before Jesus chose the 12 in Luke's gospel, he went out and prayed all night. Jesus teaches his disciples to pray in Luke's gospel. In Matthew, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is saying, don't do your practice of piety or devotion to be seen by others. And he talks about giving charitably, alms, prayer, and fasting. And it's in that context that he says, when you pray like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Do you know that's on that Bible that's open when you pull in here every day? The Lord's Prayer is on that. My mind's still on lunch, and that's what's on that sign out there. But it just comes as part of the Sermon on the Mount, which is just a sermon, dialogue. I mean, it's just monologue. In Luke's gospel, they observe him praying. They're watching him pray. It's Luke chapter 11. And then they say to him, Lord, teach us to pray like that. And he says, well, when you pray Our Father in heaven. So Luke just has this beautiful emphasis on Jesus and his prayer life. He prays from the cross. You know, in Mark, it's, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, it's, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So, you got this emphasis on prayer. Look at the parables. Look at the second parable. It's a parable about a man who shows up at midnight knocking on his friend's door. And the friend says, go away, what do you want? And the man knocking says, well, I've had some guests come, like maybe their flight arrived late last night in Knoxville, and they need a place to stay, and I need to feed them bread, because that's showing good hospitality. But we're all out of bread, and you have some, so give me some of your bread to give to my guests. And the guy says, go away. And he just keeps on knocking. And finally, the man gets up and gives him the bread. And what's that about? Is that about bread? Is that about hospitality? Or is that about persistence in prayer? If a neighbor who doesn't want to get up in the middle of the night and wake up his kids will finally get up and give you the thing you're asking for because you persistently knock, how much more will God answer your prayers if you're persistent? It's a prayer. It's a parable about prayer. Do you remember that parable in any of the other Gospels? No, you don't, because it's just in Luke. Look at the next to last parable. The parable of the persistent widow. So here's a widow who can't get justice from an unjust judge in Israel, which is a really bad thing. Judges were prominent, significant. They were important for society functioning properly in Israel. They had great authority. And here's one who doesn't respect God and he doesn't respect justice. And here's a woman who's not getting justice because this judge won't give it to her. She has no hope of getting justice in this culture. She has no means of correction of that. She has no power. The judge has all the power. There's no appeals court. But she just keeps on badgering him until he finally says, all right, I'll give you the justice you're asking for. Sound like Matthew McConaughey there. The judge was not Matthew McConaughey. I don't know why I said all right. But he gives her the justice she asked for. What's that about? That's about persistence in prayer. If an unjust judge will give this widow the justice she asked for, he's unjust, and yet he'll do it because of her persistence. How much more will God give to his children, since God is good and just, if we ask him persistently? So I'm not going to take the time to go through all these, but another emphasis in Luke is discipleship involves giving all your possessions, giving up everything and following him. And won't surprise you, there's two parables about wealth, the rich fool and the rich man and Lazarus. So I want to read the Gospels, not just read a parable in the Gospels. So it helps you to study Luke's Gospel, what's important to Luke, what does he emphasize, and these parables fall right in line with that. And that'll help you sometimes understand what might be significant in that story. Third thing, hear the setting in the particular Gospel. I just did that. I actually combined those two. What did this parable mean in the original historical setting? That's like, who are tax collectors? Who's a Samaritan? And then how is that story used in the gospel? So that's 2 and 3. Number 4, translate the parable for your audience. Now here's where we want to go beyond just giving explanation. Because we want to do more than just give them information. We want there to be room for God to capture their heart, for them to be caught in the story and suddenly realize something about themselves. Sort of that punch in the face moment. You ever had one of those moments where God just sort of punched you in the face and you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that? What am I doing? How have I held those attitudes? Why have I thought that? Why have I treated these people this way? Why do I continue to make this decision? And it just becomes clear to you. One of those moments where God really captures your heart. Stories give room for God to do that through His Spirit. So once I determine how the audience would have heard that parable and how it would have punched them in the face, so to speak, maybe instead of just explaining all that and then at the end giving an invitation, maybe I tell a similar kind of story that might capture someone else in their own time, using points of reference they can understand. So, in keeping with that, I brought with me all the way from Shawnee, Oklahoma, Clarence Jordan's Cotton Patch translation. Translation would be a loose definition of what this is. It's more of a paraphrase. But it was written by Clarence Jordan, who was a graduate of Southern Seminary, could have had a cushy teaching position, but ended up going to Georgia in the 1950s, and he started a community there called the Koinonia Fellowship, which was an integrated community. in Georgia in the 1950s because of what he viewed as ethnic and racial injustice, and it certainly was present there. He started a community where people lived together of all colors. They farmed and raised their own crops and tried to have their own, community where they could survive there and do it in an integrated way. Pretty radical stuff for a New Testament scholar. He also did this translation of the New Testament, or paraphrase, in the language of, it's written like, what if Jesus were in Georgia in the 1950s? How would he have said what he said? And so this is his parable. Since I've already talked a good bit about the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's a good example. So this is his version of it for 1950s Georgia. Okay? One day, and it's going to sound a little dated because this is 1950s, right? One day, a teacher of an adult Bible class got up and tested Jesus with this question: "Doctor, what does one do to be saved?" Jesus replied, "What does the Bible say? How do you interpret it?" The teacher answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." "That is correct," answered Jesus. "Make a habit of this and you'll be saved." But the Sunday school teacher, trying to save face, asked, but just who is my neighbor?" Then Jesus laid into him and said, "A man was going from Atlanta to Albany, and some gangsters held him up. When they'd robbed him of his wallet and brand new suit, they beat him and drove off in his car, leaving him unconscious on the shoulder of the highway. Now, it just so happened that a white preacher was going down the same highway. When he saw the fellow, he stepped on the gas and went scooting by. Shortly afterwards, a white gospel song leader came down the road, and when he saw what had happened, he too stepped on the gas. Then a black man, traveling that way, came upon the fellow, and what he saw moved him to tears. He stopped and bound up his wounds as best he could, drew some water from the water jug to wipe away the blood, and then laid him on the back seat. He drove on into Albany and took him to the hospital and said to the nurse, "Y'all take good care of this white man I found on the highway. Here's the only $2 I got, but you all keep account of what he owes, and if he can't pay it, I'll settle up with you when I make a payday." Now, if you'd been the man held up by the gangsters, which of these three, the white preacher, the white song leader, or the black man, would you consider to be your neighbor? The teacher of the adult Bible class said, "Why, of course, the one who treated me kindly." Jesus said, "Well then, you get going and start living like that." You find yourself caught there just for a moment. And I don't always have that with me, and I'll often use that when I'm teaching parables with students. And most recently, I did this in class a few weeks ago. I retold that story. When I said "nig," I could see it on their face. They thought I made the mistake, that I started to say "nig," and it wasn't in the book, that I did it, that it was and they looked at me like, they looked shocked. And I said, "Now you do know that's what the Cotton Pat says." And they're like, "Oh, I guess I was just telling it so well. They thought it was my," but I said, "No, that wasn't that's what the Cotton Pat says." And it catches you. If the Good Samaritan doesn't work because people think the Samaritan's good and will stop, of course, then you need to retell a story where someone's most hated enemy is the hero of the story. And if it doesn't make somebody mad, you're not doing it right. Now, maybe you shouldn't do this on the first Sunday somewhere. You get called to preach somewhere. I'd hold off till my people trusted me a little bit. But at some point, that's where you have to go with one of these. If everybody just nods their head and says yes, and then says, "Well, let's go have lunch" at the end of that, then you're not doing it right. Somebody should be a little unsettled when you tell that story. Let me tell you what they do to people who tell stories like that. They crucify them. Well, I think we're probably out of time. So we'll pick up tomorrow morning. I think it's 9. Yes, and I'm going to give you time for a little bit of questions. I stopped 10 till. So we'll pick up back at 9, and I'm going to look at specific parables. and talk about them a little bit tomorrow. So if you have a question, I'd be more than happy to attempt to answer it. Or maybe you're just ready to depart, but I'm here for you. Yes, sir.
Really interesting point there. We've talked about in some of the classes that we've had, but the message that you bring is going to hurt. It's going to bring about conviction. How far do you go as to, when Jesus talks about being a shepherd, breaking the leg of a sheep, how far do you go?
Yeah, that's one of the tensions. You got to have a prophetic voice. You got to challenge. And when you do, people are not always going to respond kindly to it. I mean, look at what happens to the prophets. They end up in prison, sawn in half, utterly rejected. At the same time, we've got to be a shepherd who still has the credibility and the relationship with the people to guide them. And that's a challenge. I mean, I wish I had the formula for it. I do think you have to build your credibility with your congregation before you start bringing the heat. They have to trust you and know you care about them, and you earn that. Blood and sweat, that's what you ought to give. Respect has to be earned. And so I think once you have built that kind of relationship with your people, and this requires staying a while. And so when you're moving around about every 18 months, it's really hard to do this. But when you plant yourself somewhere and you build credibility with people, then I think you can challenge them. And I grew up in Binghamtown. Preacher Bingham, I don't know how many years he ended up because he was still the pastor when I left, but probably 40 years. And you know what's not named after him. It just happened to be Binghamtown, and he happened to be Bingham, and they got together when it was a very small congregation. It wasn't named after him. Unknown little fact there. But he built such credibility there and respect that he could challenge. William probably ended up doing more challenging, but he has that too. Now he's been the pastor there for 40 years, or he's been there his whole, since he was 15 or 16 doing something on staff. I'm not saying you have to stay that long, but there's something to that, rooting yourself, building that kind of credibility with people, and then you can challenge. It doesn't happen quickly. Or you'll be looking for a new church, whether you want to or not. Yeah. And I got pastor folks here. Does that sound about right? I mean, how do you walk that line between?
The sheep are running away from you. You press too hard.
Yep.
Yeah. You got to build a relationship with them. It just takes time. You got to love on them.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And you're Barberville what is it? East Barberville. That'd be your.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the same thing. You gotta know you love them.
Yeah.
They know you love them, then they'll listen.
Yeah.
They'll listen, even if it hurts. Yeah. I worry that I get to be the interim. And let me tell you something. That's golden boy status there. Because I don't ever have to fire anybody. I don't ever have to deal with any. I come in and preach on Sunday. That's it. So I get to be golden boy, and I know that. And I have such great respect for people who have to deal with all the internal issues and do a lot more than just preach on Sunday. But sometimes I get concerned when all I hear is great sermon, we love your sermons, thank you. If they're being honest, then I wonder, am I being prophetic ever? Or am I finding ways to sort of tone it down so that it's palatable for everybody? And I don't want to be that person. And I, if they only speak well of us, I wonder if we're really fulfilling that role of challenging and having a prophetic voice. It's a good question. Anybody else? Well, then, I will see you at 9 in the morning. 9?